Well, hello, everybody. My name is John Barnwell, and I'm here north of the city of Detroit, the Straits, continuing the Gabriel Chronicles here with Dr. Douglas Gabriel, also north of the city of Detroit, the Straits. And we're continuing on in Dr. Gabriel's personal adventure into the realms of metaphysical worldviews and the mystery of the Christ and how they might come together in the most wholesome way and in the way in which our Lord intended. And so, in light of that, we're going to just let Dr. Gabriel roll out on his adventure.
Why, thank you, John. Yes, I'm so glad that you brought Christ into it because that's, first off, these things are a tremendous catharsis for me. Basically, because I have forgotten way more things than I can ever imagine I forgot. And I have to go back and look stuff up, right? And as I look it up, I go, whoa, look what happened there. I looked up some things in the last 2 days because where this conversation has led us, which really shocked me. They surprised me. So I'm going to not leave the East Coast and come back to Springfield in my long descriptions of the life of an exorcist, because now I'm going, I left the Catholic Church and now I went off and ran into all these psychic healers and other people healing different ways. And now I'm talking about this lady named Ellen in Wilmington who had endless money and basically was probably the deepest student of psychism, paranormal activity, spiritism, any of that, anything to do with Edgar Cayce, anything to do with Keith Reinhardt, this bizarre psychic, anything to do with the radionics devices that came from England, from Delaware Labs. And that's where I left the story off. And I mentioned on the way out that I would say, I laughed and said, I'll tell you then now some real strange stuff that happened there with her. Because I was describing how she had all the secret papers of these organizations because she was very, very, very rich and nothing stood in her way. So she had gone to the Delaware laboratory in England and she had met the guy who was kind of the theorist for that. The theorist for early on was a guy named Dr. Douglas Baker. He was a doctor and he worked with George Delaware, and he basically created the substructure to explain what he wrote a book with Delaware called Biomagnetism. And then technically he wrote 100 books after that. Now I just want to point out, these aren't Rudolf Steiner books. These are just a little bit of information in big books delivered as part of his thing called, I think it's called Claremont College. So he was in the original psychical society in England, where a lot of this stuff blossomed. And that's why Delaware Labs was in England. And a lot of these people came from England. Well, he was the theoretician for these machines, which I described last time. They're called radionics devices, many styles of them. There's, 50 or more styles of all kinds of people making them, but Delaware himself had many styles of it. And the thing about Dr. Douglas Baker, who was a friend of Ellen's, and she brought Dr. Douglas Baker up to her place to do a workshop. And so I got to meet him, and he's like a Manly P. Hall. He wasn't psychic. And remember, these devices can only be ran by the psychic who's the interface. They're also limited in their capacity by that psychic's ability to really penetrate the 3 levels of spirit that you have to look at, not just one. Dr. Douglas Baker did not have the capacity to run those machines, but he had a tremendous capacity to write all these books. Later, he did 10,000 lectures, 400 of them are on video. They say he has 100 books. He died back in 2012, but I met him then and stayed in contact with him for a while because I saw he was kind of like Rudolf Steiner. He's one of these absolute astounding minds that anything they train their mind on, they just do a tremendous job in being able to understand it and explain it to other people. So she brought him to Wilmington, and she had a room full of these devices. One of them was in a dark room, and it's called a psychic camera. And the reason she brought him is because she let me play with that, and I was able to get it to work. And so she called up Douglas Baker and said, because he was teaching in America for about 10 years, and he was somewhere not too far away, paid for him to come in and show me how to use it properly. Because this is the machine they call the looking glass machine. So when you hear all this stuff about going back in time, or they can read things, through space, or they can tell you what's inside of a secret building, blah, blah, blah. It's using this device or something like it, something extrapolated from it. You put your hand on one pad, you put your hand on the other pad. You have to be in a dark room. So you, just like a photographer, there's a red light in the room, and you have to take sensitive, photographic paper, put it inside this thing, close the little door, put your hands on there. Now, if you want to put a picture of a UFO on one, and these are the ones that are famous in the book, Cosmic Pulse of Life. I think I mentioned that I knew Trevor Constable, went out and met him. He would do this. So would Galen Hieronymus, who I never got to meet, but I knew some of his students. You could put a picture of a UFO on one pad, and the psychic puts their hand on it, and then it takes a picture, and it comes out. Well, actually, you put your hand on the other one until the picture comes out to make the circuit. But so let's say you take a picture of a UFO, put it here, put my left hand on that pad, my right hand on this one, put this emulsion paper in there. You're in the dark room and you meditate on whatever it is you want to say. I want to see the inside of this. What's the inside of this look like? A picture comes out. Okay. Now, this is almost beyond belief, but you can go get it. Peter Kelly has some of the biggest and best of these, and that's actually the design I somewhat used as a stimulus to create the cube, but it's a certain type of antenna. So it's an antenna that can go through space and time, and it's got a 7-spiral wire wrap of copper on top and one at the bottom. These two vortices that come together, they interpenetrate, and at that point is where the psychic puts their energy and says, I'm going to either go into the future or I'm going to go into the past. I'm going to go here or there. It doesn't matter. Right now, if I want to, I could go, on this device somewhere, and it's called objective viewing. And they have made a science of this in the military. So these devices, so like, for instance, she gave me she says, okay, here's a handkerchief from, because remember, she was one of the big donors to Edgar Cayce's group, the Association of Research Enlightenment. She had a handkerchief from him that he held on himself when he'd go into trance, and a brilliant gold light would explode through his body. He'd go into trance, and then he could go anywhere. They'd say, go to John Barnwell in Lake Orion, go to this address and see what's wrong with him. Edgar Cayce would go there, see it, not only diagnose, but also then prescribe. So she hands me the handkerchief. I put it on my hand, put it here, put it here. The first time I did this, and I'm thinking, gosh, this is Edgar Cayce, man. I'm tripping out. I'm touching something Edgar Cayce touched. And what comes out? What seemed to be a picture, because it's kind of bluish white light, but it's all just like, I don't quite know how to describe it. Anyway, it glows kind of. And it looked like a person lying down with radiant things coming from him. Edgar Cayce lying down in trance. That blew her mind. That convinced her. And we experimented on other things, but I couldn't get it to work that well. So she thought, well, I'll bring over the number one guy who worked with George Deloire, who's my buddy. I think he was up in New York teaching or something. Brought him down, did a little workshop there at her castle, and then worked with me a little bit, and we were able to tune that. So when people talk about that kind of stuff, it's very real. Now, I want to make some other general remarks. Anytime I would see anyone, especially around the Association of Research Enlightenment, those people used all those devices. Some of them had orgone devices, right? Very bad energy around someone who uses orgone. It can kill you. It can rebound on you and kill you if you don't know how to use it. So I'd see this and go, whoa, do you have an orgone box at home? And they were illegal, right? They were illegal at the time because they said that people used them as practicing medicine without a license, diagnosing and trying to heal people. That's the reason Ruth Drown died in prison. Reich died in prison. So people were very sensitive about this. But Douglas Baker, I wanted to mention him because that comes up in the story a little bit later. He was an amazing person, but he didn't use any psychism. He didn't go into trance. He didn't channel. He was simply incredibly clear-minded. And he was kind of like, as I say, Manly P. Hall. So that was another step. And it kind of made me get a little bit edgy about the whole thing that I'd just been and still was working in the command center at Fort Devens for 101st Airborne Green Berets, sent down from the highest technical school in signal intelligence to try to get these people to be able to communicate. That's what I was doing 5 days a week. On the weekends, I'd go and do this crazy stuff. And it was like, here I am again, involved in machines. And I didn't like machines. As a matter of fact, I'd pretty much decided by the end of that year, I wanted nothing ever to do with machines again. And as you know, I'm a Luddite basically at this point. And so that's one element of it. But the psychic element of it is that Blavatsky Helena Petrovna Blavatsky came to America in 1875 to basically, more or less, perhaps intellectually, you might call it intellectual clairvoyance, but she had the capacity to just remember stuff and write down Isis Unveiled. And then you have all these books were in Ellen's library. That's the reason I'm saying this. Ellen would hand me a book, and she was testing me. And she'd say, okay, what's the book? What's in the book? And I go, oh my. But I had learned the trick of Edgar Cayce. Lay down on a book, go to sleep. When you wake up, the content of the book will be in your head. That's what he did. He read the Bible continuously throughout his life. When he ended reading it, he'd start again every year. I would lay my head on it, or I'd hold it and tell her what's in it, and it freaked her out.
Yeah, Rudolf Steiner could do that too. And it's a little known fact. And the whole idea of it spins around what's called bibliomancy, and where you just open a book to a page, or a book falls off the shelf open to a particular page that's relevant. And life is always in time with itself.
I've seen you do that 100 times. It's unfriggin' canny that you can open a book and turn to the page that you wish to quote. Nothing underlined, no bit corners. No, you just open. And the way you open the book, the way John handles a book, I swear it's like he understands the book before he even opens it. But when he opens it, it'll be to the page that he wants. He goes, oh, yeah, here it is. Or he might have to turn one page and go, oh, here it is. I swear I've seen this happen so many times. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Well, that being said, by the way, we're not trying to develop some kind of cult of personality here. This is kind of an anti-cult of personality. We're trying to throw people back on their own resources, of which they're probably, in most cases, of the people that are interested in listening to what we have to say, far more developed than they realize themselves, having gone through numerous incarnations over the millennia in various ancient cultures that were preparatory toward coming to the central mystery of Earth evolution as a whole. And that's, of course, the incarnation of Christ in Jesus of Nazareth, in the River Jordan, and the mystery of Golgotha, the crucifixion, and then the following ascension and resurrection, about which Rudolf Steiner said that Christ returned time to mankind. And so that's an important consideration here when you're thinking in terms of how to understand these conversations, is that we always assume that there's a certain relationship to time when it's involved in discussing ancient mysteries or the Middle Ages or any specific time period, that the divine spiritual powers play different roles during different time periods, and mankind is configured differently now than he was configured on a level of soul in the ancient world. So just to go back and try to reenact Egyptian rites or something, you're not going to get the same result that the ancient Egyptians got, for example. That was superseded by the mystery of Golgotha. And the central mystery of ancient Egypt left Egypt, basically. The mystery of Osiris was no longer the same after Moses, who was a high priest of Heliopolis, a high priest of the sun mysteries. When he left, a certain important aspect of the mysteries of ancient Egypt receded into the background. And now that we're recapitulating the ancient Egyptian period, we have to struggle against with the similar challenges, but in a different way. And so in our age, it's the forces of materialism that we're struggling with, and scientism, and all of that realm of abstract thinking that generates through fear. And so I just wanted to give some people some context, but I don't want to derail this wonderful story.
Well, the stories just go, like you say, they go to support these concepts that both you and I talk about a lot. For instance, what you just said, it's the materialism that caused people to go towards the machines because the machines fascinate them. And this started in the 1840s, and then in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you just have a tremendous amount of people pouring forth channeled material, trance-born material. And that's not where it's at. And so I didn't like these machines. I was only doing it for entertainment, basically, because I hadn't, it was brand new and I was checking it out. I never, ever had to seek another orgone box once I found one that had been set up properly with flowing water through it. That was it. You better stay away from that. You can't control chemical ether unless you are a highly moral person. It will rebound on you and it can do the opposite. Instead of give you life, it will take your life. I've actually known people like Herman Menke who experimented with it, and Trevor Constable. He used an orgone box with water flowing through it and either various types of lead or copper pipes that he could then literally cause clouds to form and rain in the desert. So these machines are very real.
Yeah. One of our roommates over at the Mayflower House over on Telegraph, Mark Knopfler has a song, Telegraph Road. I think that's funny. Anyways, it was this guy, Dan, and he had a cloudbuster, like the device that Constable used that was created by Wilhelm Reich, the student of Sigmund Freud. And these long metal tubes, and you'd point them up in the air, and you could change the cloud formations. But one time Dan was using it, and he thought maybe a good idea to ground himself. The cloudbuster is grounded into water, so like a stream or something, so that it's thoroughly grounded to the earth. So he thought it'd be a good idea if he grounded himself, and he went over to a chain link fence, and he grabbed it, and a lightning bolt hit the fence, and it wasn't even cloudy. So it's a little dangerous tinkering with certain things.
Yeah, Herman had those. He had 1,000 of those. He created all these devices, and basically he had to create a device to unparalyze himself after the orgone box backed up on him one time. And matter of fact, I helped him with that. And he was just, they call it borderland science. Well, he was beyond the borderland. Here's the deal. You don't need a cloudbuster. You need to do exactly what they found, the research of Reich. Read Reich. Don't go to the Reich machines. Because usually when they create a machine, they've gone way too far into materialism, and they literally become the tool of Ahriman, who started incarnating through materialism in 1840, and now we believe is literally incarnated in the human body at this point. And look around you. It's the machines that rule our life. We are slave to them. They're our slaves. We don't acknowledge they're our slaves. That makes us basically bound to them. So I wasn't going to be bound, because what you talked about, whatever you call it, when the book falls from the shelf and it opens to the right page. Well, I told that story in a talk with you once. But when I arrived in Fort Bragg, like the second day, I go into this bookstore. Book falls from the shelf. I pick it up. It's Rudolf Steiner. I've been looking for Steiner books. I couldn't believe it. I was like, bolt of lightning. First word I see is what I'm looking for, Akashic Records. And I'm going, oh my Lord, it's true. This guy says he speaks from the Akashic Records. This is what I want. I want someone who says that what they're saying is an intuition that is real and can be applied. So as I told the story before, I went up and I said, I'll buy these books. I forget whether it was a dozen or 2 dozen. Someone had purchased all of them, right? And then they didn't show up. I believe it was that guy who was my double, right? He talked like me, he thought like me, he ordered those books, and then he got emergency order to leave. At the same time, I had an emergency order to come down to Fort Bragg, and we missed each other by literally seconds. I believe they were his. Anyway, I ate those books up. I don't know if I slept from the time that I started reading it until I read all of them. I said, this is good. And the back was the name of the press. So next furlough I went up to New York, and I went to the Anthroposophic Press in Spring Valley, New York on Hungry Hollow Road, and found there an entire community, a senior community, big biodynamic farms, a Waldorf school, an auditorium for performance of eurythmy and other things, and the press, the Anthroposophic Press. I bought all of the books in English by Rudolf Steiner that I didn't have. I don't know, at that time, I think that totaled 125 books or something. And then I found their library. And I met the librarian, Nina Remsberger, who was also a person promoting Valentin Tomberg, by the way. But she was the librarian, and I went in there and went, oh, this is fantastic. So she agreed to mail me books back and forth and told me about the New York Lending Library, where I also was able to borrow books. And so I just read Steiner like crazy, like it was breathing, it was air. I had to have every single thing Steiner ever said in my head because I was checking him out, seeing if he was right. That's what I did with all these things. And I was, judging it against my own experience, going, yeah, that happened to me. That's right. That is exactly what it looks like. So totally, by the time I got to Ellen, I had already absorbed all these Steiner books. And so my brain is now completely exploded. And so she's handing me, and I'd read a lot of Manly P. Hall, every word in the Secret Teachings of the Age, even with them, I had to get one of those things to look really closely because the words are so small, big, giant book, Secret Teachings of All Ages, all of Edgar Cayce. And so here I am in this library with Ellen, and she'd hand me these books and say, what do you think of this? Now, a lot of these books I'd never seen. So she hands me the book of Oahspe. John's laughing because nobody knew or talked about the book of Oahspe. But it goes back to the 1870s, before Blavatsky wrote Isis Unveiled, before A.J. Jackson, before all these people could have been inspired by this guy who wrote something he called the New Bible. And it was the last 25,000 years of history of mankind, including cosmogenesis, anthropogenesis. And it blew my mind because it said God was a man and a woman, a male and female. Absolutely blew my mind. But anyway, she hands me the book and I say, oh, this is, I hand it back to her. I go, I don't know that I can handle that book because once you read it, there's some doctrine in there that is bizarre, man. You have to be very careful with that book. But later in Springfield was a group that studied it by chance, which I'll be talking about later. And then she hands me another book called The Book of Urantia. Okay. And I hold the book and I start shivering and I'm going, this is channeled and it's plagiarized and it's stolen and the channeling is really weird. And though it says right on it that it's anonymous, it's not anonymous. Blah 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 blah. And I'm like, and she goes, "How can you know that by holding the book?" Later, I found out that those things were true. It took a long time for that to come to light, as a matter of fact. And later, this is unbelievable. The daughter of the guy who actually channeled parts of that and also plagiarized the last parts of it, his daughter ended up being having her child in my school that I was the headmaster of, and I taught her child. And when I got sick, she gave me a fortune to go get healed. So literally, I can say her name because she hides her name. She was a daughter of W.K. Kellogg, who was the brother of Dr. John Kellogg, who was the Seventh-day Adventist who set up that crazy sanatorium that they did the movie on with Anthony Hopkins called Welcome to Wellville. Total vegetarianism, hose you down with water, cut out a third of your colon, and then, meditate and all this stuff. It was the Seventh-day Adventist on steroids. And his brother, he's the guy who invented all Kellogg's cornflakes, all the Kellogg's, those cereals, that was Kellogg. And his brother, the guy who literally was responsible through a couple in Chicago called the Sadlers, but he was responsible. W.K. Kellogg was the writer of that book. And the reason it was anonymous is because, I didn't know this. I looked it up last night. There's whole communities of these people still trying to understand this stuff. The second part is about the missing life years of Jesus. The first part is about how all the archangels and angels and all the hierarchy created everything. These books are channeled, and they are literally the words of Lucifer. And in some cases, because of the mechanism they use, trance mediumship, the mechanism is provided by Ahriman, and it was all started after about the mid 1800s.
Yes, it gets a little. It's challenging, and we're sharing with you these stories, not with the hopes that you're necessarily going to try and run and do the same things that we did, because the reason we've come as far as we have, of course, is we've made a lot of mistakes, and we hope that you can learn by our mistakes. But Oahspe, yeah, I found my copy in San Francisco in a bookstore when I was living in San Francisco, up on the top shelf. And it was like my hand was guided up there. And Oahspe means, "Oh, Father, speak." And the gentleman who wrote the book bought a typewriter, which had just been invented. And he was sniffing laughing gas. And he went into a state of automatic writing with laughing gas and typed the whole thing out. So it's just really a curio. I think I still have that copy upstairs somewhere. Who knows? But and getting into books like Urantia and all of that, it goes back to what I was saying regarding the Egyptian period, because in the early periods, leading into the sentient soul period of ancient Egypt, Babylon, and all of that, the Sumerian influence, what you have is that the divine spiritual beings could, so to speak, ray into your capacity to perceive the spiritual world. But with the departure of that sun mystery with Moses, that was cut off, and so there's a certain portion of mankind that withered away. That was the part of you that received that, and that withered portion of your soul capacity is the part of soul in which the adversaries, Lucifer and Ahriman, strive to inhabit, to divert you from the Christic course, the course of the mystery of Golgotha, to lose that impulse of the wholesome development of the spirits of freedom and love, as Rudolf Steiner called it. And so the Grail mysteries has to do with being able to compensate for that deadening of that aspect of soul, which we can say is perhaps related to what Wilhelm Reich was referring to when he was talking about orgone. It could be, Rudolf Steiner does elsewhere make a point about the Rosicrucians making experiments pertaining to that realm of being that existed between the etheric and the physical. And so I'm not saying anything definitive. I'm just saying that there is things that have been done in those areas. But you see that this whole idea of wanting to enter into a trance or something of that nature, a somnambulant state, is to be a passive medium, is an unwholesome path. unwholesome, along with hypnosis is unwholesome because you're allowing other individuals to act upon your will, uh, and you're unconscious of it. You don't want things functioning in you unconsciously. And that's so much of what's going on right now with the Tavistock programming and television and all of that, that they're basically entraining you into thinking along certain lines. And so the reason we discuss these things is because we want to be conscious of them. Once you become conscious of them, then they don't have the same power of you. Same with any kind of ritual activity like Freemasonry and things like that, that they can work in your etheric body. You don't understand the symbols, but they're there. And anthroposophy or spiritual science antidotes all of that. And so don't forget that Rudolf Steiner said Christ is infinitely more powerful than the adversaries. Back to you.
One of these things, one of the reasons I'm doing this is because, as you just pointed out very subtly, I have made all the mistakes for you folks. So just if you listen to the path I've been pushed down, thrown down, dragged down, that is not the path you want to go. And so I'm here to give you certain warnings. And basically, I can tell you that though I laugh about it now, I certainly wasn't laughing about it then. I was, as Rich Steiner says, do not be, do not become fascinated by anything, because then more or less you're becoming hypnotized. And so people become fascinated with these devices, machines. And now it's insane, of course, all the devices you can wear around your neck and this and that. And that. Oh my heavens, you can put them on your head now. We invented something to do transdermal induction and clearing the left and right side of the brain before they have it. Now, 5 years later, you can get 100 varieties of these. So we're not saying you need to use machines. Matter of fact, we're saying the opposite. You don't need an orgone box. All you have to do is take lead pipe, stick it into a flowing stream, and aim it at the sky, and you will see one of two things happen. If there's a cloud there, it will disperse it. If there's no cloud there, it will pull it together right in front of your eyes. It's as simple as that. If the person holding the lead pipe is able to have a clear enough thought that they literally invite the angels to come down and participate in this creative activity. So you don't need any of these devices. And that's what I was trying to say to Ellen. She was never really clairvoyant. She had a little bit of it from hanging out with, these Mark Prophet, who probably was somewhat clairvoyant, or Keith Reinhardt, or, the people at ARE. Some of them were healers. A lot of them were working on being healers. And of course, I got a lot of experience with the Church of Christian Scientists, because that's what they do. And then they taught me how to eat well, whether it was macrobiotics or whether it was wheatgrass therapy or whether it was a little book that they all lived by called 10 Talents, which is the Seventh-day Adventist cookbook. They were basically the first really big-time vegetarians. When I got back to Springfield, Missouri, if I went to the health food store, it was to the Seventh-day Adventist health food store. And Seventh-day Adventists are what created the Book of Urantia. And so that was one type of community. There was a group in Springfield that was connected to Oahspe. They were super secret because they taught astrology. And in the very conservative Baptist town of Springfield, Missouri, astrology was illegal. So we had to pull down the curtains and meet in secret, never advertise. And so this family, this Kessler family, a mom and dad and a son, all of them brilliant, but the dad was completely into Oahspe. But it was an alternate Bible. Imagine how that would have gone over with the Baptists in Springfield, Missouri. So when I got back there, I bumped into these groups. One of them was the Oahspe group, and I studied astrology and all kinds of strange things with them. Another one was the Urantia group, which they studied yoga and all kinds of things, and they were totally into automatic writing. Now, one day, before I even signed up for studying in Detroit with Werner Glass at the Waldorf Institute, I was going through, and he accepted me, knowing I was a Jesuit novice, but a Jesuit associate at the time. And he asked me, he goes, well, you're all into books. Will you open a bookstore for me? So I stayed there for part of the summer and helped him open a bookstore. And Kathleen Kennedy calls on the phone. I didn't know it. And so I told her about a book that is apropos to what we're talking about. What's the name of it, John? Mediumship, Somnambulism, and something else. It's a long title by Steiner. I told her about that and explained what's in the book. That became the movie Poltergeist because she helped Spielberg create that movie. I didn't know that until years later that another thing happened with her.
Wasn't it mediumship, somnambulism, and spiritualism?
That's it.
Yeah.
That explains what we're talking about right here. And that's the point. If someone says they channeled it, now I don't mean to bash any of these groups, okay? But if the truth sinks their boat, that's not my problem. Joseph Smith said that he channeled the angel or archangel, what was his name anyway? And he wrote it down
Moroni.
Moroni, and he wrote it down on the copper table. Supposedly he had no education, didn't know anything about the Bible, blah blah. Moroni comes to him and he's told to write this down, but Moroni uses Moroni's finger to inscribe onto gold-plated leaves of a book, which in some versions copper, which of course was never found or never seen, and that this was written down, and then that's what became the Book of Mormon. Well, let me just point something out. Do you remember the books, John, that I used to find that were the debunking of Mormonism, demonstrating that it was plagiarism taken from another book, where literally they set side by side the Mormon phrases and the book that it was taken from, right? Because Joseph Smith went down to Philadelphia. He became a printer's assistant. Someone came in with actually 2 books, but one of them is like completely plagiarized. Those books were, someone came to a printer and said, print these or whatever. And they said, no, I can't. And what they do is they rip off the front and back cover so no one knows who it's come from. They throw it in the garbage, right? He found those 2 books, went back up north, and Moroni spoke to him. And to this very day, they channeled Joseph Smith, the elder of the Mormon church, goes into a trance and channels Joseph Smith to this very day.
Yes, I don't want to step on the toes of any Mormons because they do live a wholesome family-oriented lifestyle. But then there's also the aspect of Joseph Smith tying into him reading the stela, the ancient Egyptian stela, and his translation of that, which that stela has since been translated, and it's just basically a funerary stela or tablet, and it doesn't say anything even remotely close to what he had supposedly translated it to mean. But yeah, there was a guy who wrote a novel. I forget his name right now. I used to have the book, and but the Mormons vehemently buy up any copies that go on the market so that people don't see it. And I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's a very old book, and
there's 2 of them, and they paid me $500 every time I wrote them a letter saying I had one, and I sent it to them. They wanted those out of circulation.
So that's about what I have to say up thus far. I'm like everyone else, waiting with bated breath while you continue your story.
Well, you could probably tell the story of H.P. Blavatsky better than I, but I think she's one of the greatest mediums for the manifestation of intellectual clairvoyance, but limited by her own self. That's what always happens. If you think you're going to write a new Bible, and by the way, rightfully so, in the 1840s, a bunch of people were able to reach into or reach beyond the threshold into the etheric. And what did they see? Their version of the whole thing, right? It's what I always tell people. You want to be a psychic, go to heaven? Well, they'll send you to hell first. So you're going to see the whole thing. You're going to see, man down here and heaven up here. And it's not going to be very pretty. Well, these people get it in their head that they're going to write a new Bible, and literally in Oahspe, in the first chapter, it says clearly that the Brahmins, the Buddhists, the Mohammedans, and the Christians missed the mark. He's going to tell us how it is, and that he doesn't use Christ, he uses the name T-A-E, Tay, or whatever it is. And he has this whole other version, but really, notice he didn't put Judaism in there. Oh, but then look at the names of the books, and then it's basically a rewriting of the Old Testament with his new version taking Christ out of the equation. Same thing with so many of these. They, for instance, the one Douglas Baker, Douglas Baker was an intellectual. But when the School of Metaphysics, which was founded in Springfield, Missouri, by a friend of mine named Jeffrey, who had a little psychism to him, but he didn't, he had classes on meditation and relaxation and how to read this or how to read that. And so he gathered some other people who were, they were really working on seeing the color of your aura. Ooh. There's 3 levels of that. The first one is mostly your own projection, okay, as a psychic. So I met this guy when I got back to Springfield, when I got out of the military, and we became fast friends, and I helped him write a curriculum. So I took him to meet Douglas Baker in Unity Village, I think it was, outside of Kansas City, Missouri. And when he met Douglas Baker and realized, and I had already told him, this guy has all you need. He's got a college. He's got a correspondence course. This guy will answer your questions. He'll come do workshops for you. So the School of Metaphysics, which now has about 24 centers in the Midwest, was based upon this curriculum that we developed with out of meeting and working with the work of Douglas Baker. Very few people have ever heard of Douglas Baker. And if the School of Metaphysics at any site wants to get mad at me because you don't know that your curriculum was derived from Claremont College, which was the work of Douglas Baker, well, take a look at the books and you'll know. Oh, that's right. Wait, they have their books in their life, and they sell their Douglas Baker's books, but also a lot of the other books that might get you there pretty quickly to develop your own, I will call it clairvoyance in modern New Age parlance. It's called psychism, right? Well, it's nothing more than the early, mid to late 1800s, early 1900s spiritism that came to America with the Fox sisters and table knocking and seances and on and on and on. And every single spiritual leader that wanted to have his own community that said that they were channeling whoever, it didn't matter, from Tibetan Buddhists to whoever, came to America and founded a community, oftentimes, strangely enough, in Ohio. But anyway, so I worked with him and we developed this curriculum. Now I look and I'm going, holy moly, in 1975 I did that. I had no idea that this was going to continue to this very day. And I looked up their budget and everything. They're all over the place. And it's amazing. And so another thing was the fact that the second that I got back to Springfield, Missouri, because I was trying to figure what I wanted to do. And the only thing I really wanted to do was go back to where Father William had taken me to become a Trappist monk, a hermit. Because why? I had a stack of books taller than me that I was reading. I was reading Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine for the second time. Now, John should laugh at that. How could anybody read it a first time, let alone a second time, without your brain exploding? I was reading everything of Blavatsky's and had finished that. I read all of Steiner's books that I could find in English and was having them sent to me, but that was a slow process. And read all these secret papers of these groups that Ellen had, and I'm like, none of this means anything to me. I don't want the machines. I don't want the fascination. I don't want the glamour. But I worked with the groups that were in town. So the first thing I did when I got back was I had to eat. And I was as I told you, I was total vegan. I would vomit if I thought I'd eaten something from an animal. Not because I was theoretical. It was something that was happening to my body. I don't know. So my sister and I go up to the little co-op, and it's got a restaurant called Earth Wonder Is. And so we go in, nobody's there, and we sit down, and then the lady from the co-op comes in and says, the cook left yesterday, and there's nobody here to cook. I said, well, I'm really hungry, and I can't get good food anywhere. Can I go back and cook myself something? So I went back and made a millet loaf from 10 talents, because I basically had adopted that way of eating from the Seventh-day Adventists, right? So I go back, and so the lady who owns this place says, well, will you do this on a regular basis? I said, no, I'm not going to do it on a regular basis, but I have to eat. So I'll cook until you get me somebody I can train. So I trained somebody, and he was such a dolt that he couldn't make the soups. And the restaurant is determined by their soups. So I made these recipes, a whole bunch of them, called and we sold them in the co-op next door. It was actually connected. And I lived there, by the way. I lived there. I went into the room the previous cook was living in because he booked and we don't know where he went. So I put these together and it became later a guy, the cook, not the one I trained, but someone else came along and took those, called it Earth Wonder Is Soup in a Bag. And they were sold in Kmart's. And the guy became filthy rich. He moved to Blue Lick, Missouri, had kind of a cult around him. And he, for a long time, like 10 years ago or whatever, I checked in, he was still going strong. So that was another group that I got involved in. I didn't want anything to do with them. Same thing with the School of Metaphysics. But I felt it was my obligation. And certainly I did not want to get into the group with the Urantia because they were into automatic writing. And so they thought that was a big deal. And a number of them did automatic writing. So they asked me if I could do it. And so, of course, I showed them that anyone can do it. That's the whole point. It's not you. It's the Steiner describes it in those lectures, that lecture I mentioned. But it's a fluid that comes out of your etheric body and your astral body and mixes around. And for instance, he describes that handwriting, everyone writing the same way, has created a elemental pattern that is practically a living being. And if you know how to tap into that, all you do is go to sleep and then it writes. But I started that when I was 15, as I mentioned in a previous talk, and wrote a whole book on it while I was supposedly asleep. I'd wake up in my sleep, and so I could go back to sleep, I'd just put my hand and just start writing stuff, So every night I'd write another page for this book in a handwriting that wasn't mine. Well, so that would impress people, and it would make them get fascinated. And that's exactly what you don't want. Because the minute you're fascinated, you go into unconsciousness, subconsciousness, trance, and what would now be called hypnotic states. So we actually would recommend that you don't. I mean, it's fine to study all those things. It's marvelous to study all of them. Matter of fact, I love studying all of that. And every single new group I ever heard of, I jumped right in and said, yeah, sure, I'll do that. So I get into the Urantia group, and this book that made me shake and shiver, 2,000 pages. I read it, especially because there's the missing life of Christ in there. But then I realized I'd already read it, like 10 other books in the missing years of Christ. This person just, the ones that were back in his day, he just read those and then just wrote it down in his own version. So beware of false prophets. Beware of antichrists. And I'm going to emphasize this. These are luciferically possessed people in many cases. And it's not just Lucifer possessing them. They're using a mechanism, an aromatic mechanism that is very, very bad for them because it goes right into their physical body, especially if they're using orgone boxes or radionics devices. And so, you hear about all these things. Oh, the looking glass experiments. Oh, isn't it fantastic? People can go back in time. Anyone can go back in time through your DNA in your body, and anyone can go forward in time. It's not a problem. You can go anywhere on the earth in your sleep. They call it astral projection. It's not really that. It is your ego and your astral body are drawn to where you're needed because people are in need. And like we talked about last time or time before, Avalokiteshvara, the being of Christ, this being of love, wants to serve everybody. So as Daskalis calls it, exomatosis. During your sleep, you're supposed to be going to the temple of the sun, or the what's it called, the mother lodge of the sun. Call it the Temple of Sophia, call it whatever you want. That's where Christ is. And in your sleep, you can do oftentimes way more good than you can do when you're awake. So everyone can get there.
Yes, the inner school. And it's important to emphasize that we're not saying that these things can't be done. They're a good example. I thought I might have it in my vicinity, but I don't see it around. There's a book called The Gate of Remembrance by a British gentleman, F. Bly Bond, and he was able to find the foundations of the earlier chapel on a property of a church in England through that automatic writing process. And he was able to actually draw the layout, and then they went over and they dug it up. And so it was quite celebrated. And it gave a new impetus into that whole idea of automatic writing that was also very popular amongst the French Spiritist movement. And so there are these things, but that doesn't mean they're good things. That doesn't mean you want to go out and try and uh, get involved with something through a Ouija board, for example. That these things can happen, but it's what you don't want. Again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there was a portion of soul of which, well, in the Greek mysteries, it was conceived of as that you received through the goddess Demeter the capacity to perceive spiritual beings. But as uh, time marched on, that influence receded. And so then you have Persephone and you have that whole change of soul configuration. But as I said, in the Egyptian version of it, you see that there's this darkening that takes place, that you have the weeping Isis, weeping for the Osiris, who's no longer to be found in the same realm, because he left with Moses. And so you have this great saga unfolding that's being watched through various mystery cults. You can look to the Northern Mysteries with the Götterdämmerung, the ending of the mysteries that they understood it in preparation for something new to come about. Or you can go to the mysteries in Ireland, the Hibernian mysteries, and you see a mystery knowledge and mystery centers lecture cycle is what I recommend for understanding both of those things. And then you get into the Eastern mysteries. That's the Grail impulse itself, is that in the myth, the angels took the Grail and they lifted up to heaven until a man would come that would be worthy enough to become the Grail king. And that these things were carried in picture language by minnesingers and troubadours, and that you have this whole impulse that's distinct from the Church of Rome, that this is something that was being carried by the Knights Templar, and the part of the striving of the Knights Templar was to found uh, a basis in Jerusalem that was distinct from Rome. So you have this whole idea of that there's all these various streams, they all come together, and the central figure in all of it is the being that says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So it all leads to Jesus Christ if you're pursuing it in a wholesome way.
And that was the fault of Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, H.P. Blavatsky, one of the founders in 1875 of Theosophy. But the word Theosophy goes back far, far, far before that. And essentially, she wasn't a Christian. And this is what we're talking about. And later, Rudolf Steiner pointed out that she was put in occult imprisonment. Now, as I said, she's inexplicable to me, and I don't know about the stories. I can't tell you that. I never met her. She died long before I was around. But the point is, she'd go into her prayer closet. Oh, and she could manifest letters from the masters called Esoteric Buddhism. A.P. Sinnott's book was basically it was given by the masters, written in different handwritings. Blavatsky could supposedly write 2 letters at the same time with both hands at the same time simultaneously. She could supposedly go into her prayer closet and come out with a picture she'd drawn in the dark of one of the masters that would be very moving. You can even see some of these pictures that they promulgated in the Theosophical Society. And she said that she was able to literally have the masters communicate with her in a variety of different ways. And so the point is, did she contact the Christ? Because if she was clairvoyant and she didn't contact the Christ, then she's not a very good clairvoyant. And this is what Steiner said, that Ahriman in our times, starting with materialism in 1840 and moving to our time, would create his own school of psychic clairvoyant training. And everybody'd get psychic and clairvoyant. Only problem, none of them ever agreed. And so this is the point. It doesn't matter whether you're reading Mark Prophet's book, Climb the Highest Mountain, or Elizabeth Clare Prophet's books on the Saint Germain, or Blavatsky, or whatever. You need to be able to have discernment if you're going to do that, and go in and see what there is of value there and leave the rest behind. Because the limitation of the author is the limitation of the thesis. So you have to be very careful. So in essence, what I was being taught by Ellen was how to have some discrimination. And what I was taught by Father William was how to learn to protect myself from all these things fascinating me. And what I was taught by Meredith Thomas was intellectual clairvoyance, because he wasn't clairvoyant, but by golly, he could arrive at the same brilliant insights as the great clairvoyants of the past or our time. So in essence, when I went back to Springfield, here in my old town where my teacher, Father William, had passed away the year before, so I couldn't go visit him. And I started looking around, and the Jesus Restoration movement has collapsed. There was no Jesus Coffee House. New Wine Press was transformed. Matter of fact, the whole thing had moved up to Ann Arbor and other places all over the place because the people spread out from Springfield. The Catholic charismatic Pentecostal movement, the Spirit-filled movement, it was institutionalized now. And I'd go to the churches, and it was flat. I'd go to the old churches, the old Black Baptist churches, and they were still rolling down the aisles, and just the Spirit-filled churches were marvelous. But I looked around and said, okay, I'm just going to go down to Ava, Missouri, to Assumption Abbey and live in a cave, because there were some cool caves down there I liked. But I first was kind of called to do these other things, very strangely enough. I didn't really mean to get into the trouble I got into in these different groups. Matter of fact, where one day, just to show you how strange it was, and these things were happening all the time. I can't enumerate all the weird times I've been called on to do things I didn't think I could. For instance, where with the Fesslers, isn't that funny? That's like our friend Chris Fessler. I just realized that. So these teachers, they were the Oahspe teachers in astrology, were in the room, we're having an astrology class, big accident happens outside. I run outside. Some drunk teenagers, 5 of them, ran into a light pole. And one after the next, I went to each one of them, and each one of them died as I was trying to help them, right? So I was right there with them at the moment they died. No one else would come out of the house. They were all too scared. But that's happened many times to me, where literally the person next to me dies. Why is that? To be there as a transition, as a person who knows that the other side exists, because whether I liked it or not, I was cursed with that knowledge, with that experience. So I guess there's been many times that I was supposed to be there for people when they were dying. So I basically expended myself in these different directions and got into some really strange, weird things I can't even tell you, because you wouldn't believe them even if I did tell you, and they're weirder than the things I've told you. But to see that, some of my good work actually got carried on sometimes shocked me, because I was moving so fast, I didn't have the time to sit and reflect too much. So next time, what I came to out of all of this was, I wish to go back to the unseen world. I don't like the seen world.
Yes. I didn't want us to run out of time without addressing some questions that came up, because there was a garbled broadcast last show when I got to the good part. And that's interesting.
That's right. I saw the notes. Yeah.
So you got to wonder the source of that, but maybe I can get through it by just telling you where to go to find what I was talking about, because there's a different after death state for somebody who doesn't have a conscience. And so that can be found, it's now published as The Mysteries of Initiation from Isis to the Holy Grail. That's Collected Works, Volume 144. It was a cycle of 4 lectures by Rudolf Steiner given in Berlin between the 3rd and 7th of February in 1913. I showed you last week earlier editions of it, The Mysteries of East and of Christianity, and East in the Light of the West. So it has 3 different titles, but that's in the small cluster of books that I consider fundamental to try and understand the things that I tend to talk about, along with the Mystery Knowledge Mystery Centers and the spiritual guidance of mankind, and wonders of the world. So that if you bring those volumes together, of course, assuming that you have under your belt Knowledge of Higher Worlds and Its Attainment by Rudolf Steiner, plus The Outline of Occult Science, plus Theosophy, all of which are by Rudolf Steiner, it gives you the fundamental backdrop of what Douglas and I will be discussing more and more as we move into the future. And keep in mind that we were at the Waldorf Institute and they had courses on those every year, and every year we would attend those courses. So we've been through paragraph by paragraph of those texts, amongst others. And so, but the whole point of all this is to just be an ordinary human being, what a human being is meant to be, not to be anybody special.